Vladimir Putin has landed in North Korea. He is trying to expand his reach. He's trying to make more deals to get more ammunition, more weapons, and probably trying to send some more message to the entire West, not the least of which is the United States of America. We have a great guest today to break a lot of this down. One of the people I regard as one of the best North Korea experts, really in America today, and that's Dan Depetris, one of my colleagues at Defense Priorities, and writes prolifically all over articles you've seen in the West. And Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Listen, let's just jump right into it here, because there's a lot of things to get into here. And I want to, first of all, kind of lay the foundation for some of our guests who may not be quite as familiar with the North Korea issue here, or things between North Korea and South Korea, because it's not just that Putin's coming in and how that affects his war with Ukraine, though that is a major issue. But I think it's also important to look at the conditions between North and South Korea, because as we're going to discuss from a recent piece you wrote in 38 North, there's some things going on there that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, because there's been so much focus on the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Hamas war here. But here's a brief report that shows what's been happening in North Korea.
All this comes as tensions on the Korean peninsula steadily build. The US and South Korea recently conducted joint air exercises featuring a B-1 strategic bomber. It included their first precision-guided bombing drill in 7 years. South Korea this month scrapped a military pact with the North, allowing it to resume combat drills on their shared border. Seoul, for its part, said it was responding to a barrage of North Korean balloons filled with feces and trash that were sent towards the south.
Now, Dan, in your article in 38 North that came out, what was a couple of days ago, right? That June 14th.
Yeah.
One of the things you put in there, and Gary, I hope I can remember which one it was. I think it was the 4th or 5th number on this one. If you can bring that up. This is the one. That's exactly one. You got it right. You wrote that the failure of the moon, the previous president of South Korea, and the hostility of the current administration has resulted in a lack of communication between the two Koreas and a budding arms race on the Korean peninsula, with both South and Seoul and Pyongyang pointing ever more resources into developing, mass-producing the weapon systems, next-gen bombers, submarines, hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles, defense and intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance platforms needed to deter a full-blown war, or, if deterrence fails, to fight one. North Korea, meanwhile, continues to invest ever more deeply in its nuclear weapons program to compensate for its conventional military inferiority. Can you help us out, first of all, to understand what's going on in between North and South Korea that's causing that to deteriorate, even aside from these other global issues?
Yeah, well, Danny, I think a big part of the problem is, as I mentioned in the article, is a total lack of communication between North and South Korea. In the previous South Korean administration, President Moon Jae-in made it a personal prerogative to normalize relations with North Korea, or at the very least, improve reconciliation on the Korean peninsula. And he did that largely through summitry with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and he signed a pretty substantial military de-escalation accord with the North in 2018, which was a huge multi-page, very technical document, essentially separating both Koreas from the DMZ and making the military demarcation line that divides the two Koreas into, in essence, a no train and no fly zone. Part of it was also to establish these communication mechanisms in an attempt to regularize inter-Korean talks, whether it's military talks or even economic discussions. All of that is essentially gone now. The current administration, led by President Yoon Suk-yeol, he's the opposite of President Moon on the North Korea file. He never really bought into the notion of reconciling with the North. He kind of viewed it as a waste of time, and still does. So what we have here is a lot of kinetic signaling through military exercises, and in terms of actual communication, it's next to nothing.
Now, how much of that is just domestic issues between the North and South, and how much is the shift in administrations in the United States? Because when Trump was in there, I mean, he had all this charm offensive into going on. He met with Kim Jong-un. He went to North Korea and crossed the DMZ and all that and that fancy stuff there. And of course, that came to really a screeching halt in Hanoi, when what we thought was going to be a progress on denuclearization turned into be, John Bolton advocated that Trump not do that, and he just kind of scuttled it. And it just kind of then it went on, I don't know, I guess status quo until the end of his administration. Then comes in the Biden administration, and at least from my perspective, it seemed like the Biden administration went on kind of a silent mode and didn't seem to really care much about what was going on in North Korea. And then it seemed things to deteriorate. Is it a combination of all that, or did one cause the other?
No, I think it's a combination. I think you're right. And it all started after the summit in Hanoi, where basically Trump and Kim walked away from the table having signed nothing. And, I think that was a pretty big inflection point in terms of U.S.-North Korea relations, because, Kim invested a lot of his own political capital and personal capital on these negotiations, and they resulted in absolutely nothing. And that was sort of an embarrassment for him. And ever since that time, I believe the summit was February 2019. Ever since that specific time, the relations not only between Washington and Pyongyang, but relations between Seoul and Pyongyang have depreciated markedly. So I think that was probably the genesis of kind of what we're seeing, the multi-year degradation in relations across the board.
And if you could, because I'm afraid I don't recall, when did Yoon come into office in relation to when Biden came into office?
Right. So Biden, of course, was January 2021, and President Yoon was about a year later, so spring of 2022. And so there's some overlap, obviously, but Biden had a full year to do something, anything really, on the North Korea file before President Yoon came into office. And if you talk to administration officials, they keep saying that they've reached out to North Korea on multiple occasions, and the Kim regime has basically rejected all those entreaties. Part of that, obviously, is because Washington continues to insist on completely kind of irreconcilable and unrealistic objectives, namely, denuclearization, which has been U.S. policy for the last 30 years. Kim has no intention of discussing that.
And so I guess if we're not talking the same language, I guess it appears that Kim is not willing to discuss anything, and that's kind of underscores some of the problems that we've had with our foreign policy. But I'll not get into that at the moment. But let's look at the current situation here. So I believe Putin has set touchdown now in Pyongyang, or else it's coming momentarily. But let's take a look now. Shift gears a little bit to see, why is Kim Jong-un doing this? What does he stand to gain from it? Here's a short clip, and then let's talk about it afterwards.
Military and technological hardware is going to be front and center of the concerns for Kim Jong-un. As we understand, US and South Korean officials have been talking about this over recent months, that what Kim Jong-un is going to be really looking for, as we believe, in exchange for those weapons that we believe he is sending to Russia, is support with its, for example, spy satellite program and for its weapons program in contravention of UN resolutions. But of course, the even broader context to all of this is that that Russia and North Korea have this shared geopolitical belief that the US, albeit in different contexts, is trying to hem in their countries, to threaten their countries. And that's what we really see with this backdrop of worsening ties between the two Koreas, between North and South Korea, which is, again, the North Korea believing that the US is trying to bring its allies together in the Indo-Pacific to threaten North Korea's security. And we've seen, even in the hours leading up to this arrival of Putin, that there's been an exchange of fire across the demilitarized zone.
So what do you make of two of the things that he talked about there? We'll take them in order. First of all, that Kim Jong-un feels like he's being hemmed in, and that this is an American attempt to try and suppress their freedom of action. And then second of all, that he wants to get some technology and whatever from the Russian side. Let's look at the first one of that first, about the being hemmed in.
Well, I mean, obviously, the United States would disagree with the notion that they're escalating the situation, whether it be with bilateral or trilateral exercises in the Pacific with Japanese and South Korean forces. But when you look at the situation from Kim Jong Un's eyes, that's certainly a reasonable conclusion to make. I don't justify it, but I can see why he makes that assessment. What we have here, I think, on the Korean Peninsula writ large is the security dilemma in action. And that basically refers to, one country taking defensive actions is viewed by another country as belligerence. And that in turn kind of encourages an arms buildup. And we kind of get to the situation where neither side is secure, and I think that's probably what we've been seeing on the Korean Peninsula for decades, but certainly over the last 3 or 4 years now.
So you mentioned a minute ago about the unrealistic objectives of trying to seek denuclearization as a policy objective for the West in relations to our relations with North Korea. What is reasonable? What is realistic? What could the U.S. do to actually advance our security interest and lower tensions in the region? It's realistic.
Well, I think it's very realistic, and frankly, we're already living in this world. North Korea is a nuclear weapons power, whether we recognize it as such or not. The practical matter is they have nukes. They have up to 60 nuclear warheads assembled already, and recent information coming out over the last several days said they could have as many as 90, or at least fissile material for as many as 90. So any U.S. policy reform on the Korean Peninsula has to take into the very simple fact that North Korea is a nuclear weapons power. And because it's so poor, isolated, and essentially weak compared to its adversaries and competitors in the region, it's not going to, part ways with its nuclear deterrent. It would be kind of foolish for Kim Jong Un to do that. So I think any policy recommendation would have to start on that fact. I've long been of the opinion that we need to sort of forget about denuclearization and kind of essentially talk with the North Koreans about confidence building steps and de-escalation steps. And that can involve everything from caps on additional nuclear tests, underground nuclear tests, limitations on ICBM tests, and just the general dialogue about confidence building security measures on the peninsula, which we don't have with the North Koreans right now. And I think that's very dangerous. It doesn't serve deterrence well if you can't communicate with your adversary.
Yeah, that also seems to be a problem across the board with a lot of our relations. I mean, if you're not even talking, how do you even have a possibility of accomplishing anything that's beneficial to you? That would seem to be a good first step. But that's just like you said, we are where we are. So then the next part of that was that what Kim is hoping to get out of this visit from Putin is technology, especially and potentially in the space area. I wonder if you can talk to some of that.
Yeah, so up until I believe 2022, Kim has made a special emphasis, and it's really a top priority now, to basically assemble and eventually mass produce military satellites to, monitor U.S. and South Korean forces south of the demilitarized zone. And there's been several satellite tests over the last, I believe, 9 months. One of those were successful. The other two failed, very short order. There has been rumor that the successful test that took place last year was done in large part because of Russian technology or certain Russian technological elements in the satellite. So the Kim will definitely want to kind of expand that cooperation. He's hoping the Russians will be amenable to that request. Whether or not Putin, gives it is another story, but I think it's pretty clear that the North Koreans do want to bolster their ISR capabilities, and obviously military satellites is at the top of the list in that regard.
And do you think that well, a better question, what would be the ramifications of that for both South Korean and American national security interests in the region if if North Korea is successful at advancing their ISR capacities, especially their space-based and rocket-based, some of the rocket launcher technology like Gary's showing on the screen right now?
Well, look, I mean, it's obviously concerning in terms of military planners, both in the Pentagon and in the South Korean Defense Ministry, and I've spoken to South Korean diplomats about this, and they're not petrified, but they're extremely concerned about the North Koreans kind of leveling the playing field in terms of ISR capabilities. On the other hand, it could actually, ironically, reinforce deterrence and de-escalation. And by that, I mean the North Koreans would have more information about what the South Koreans and the Americans are doing. And there's less unpredictability going on. And I think this isn't to say that we should allow this to happen or support it, but I could see an argument being made that this would actually contribute to some sort of stabilization on the peninsula in terms of both sides having more accurate information on the other.
Because I mean, it's not as though we actually have a choice or in the matter anyway. I mean, they're going to get what they're going to get. But if there's some positive benefit to come out in terms of lowering the chance for miscalculation, if nothing else, I mean, that's certainly a benefit, because I mean, having nuclear or military exercises like we've had for decades and are definitely going to continue on into the future, those are one thing. But as long as we don't do anything that's provocative in terms of like attacking North Korea, which God forbid we should never do, then deterrence has a shot to continue holding.
That's true, but deterrence takes work, right? I mean, it's a very time consuming and energy filled thing to kind of maintain. And I think the United States and the South Koreans and even the North Koreans recognize that. And the problem is that they respond to each other and they overreact. So, the South Koreans, for instance, will do one of those annual military drills with the United States that's very custom, and it's been happening for years, right? And the North Koreans take that as a sign of an imminent military campaign. Obviously, it's not justified, but that's the way the North Koreans view it.
Well,
right?
and hence it goes back to your point a second ago. We need communication so that nobody can, has the chance to misunderstand what's going on. So those things really need to go hand in hand. But well, I guess we're not going to solve that one today, but it would be great. Let's look back at the next side of that this calculation here about what Russia wants and what they need. Here's one of you on that.
This is a time when North Korea has something that Russia needs. Doesn't happen very often, but North Korea does have stockpiles of ammunition that Putin would certainly like to use and has been using in the campaign in Ukraine. And that is, of course, a violation of UN sanctions. There are very few other countries that are willing to support that campaign. But here is something that North Korea has that he can offer to Putin for once. And so it has become a very transactional and useful relationship for both sides.
Now, Dan, one of the I think biggest consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war has been that it has pushed North Korea, Russia, Iran, and to at least diplomatically at this point, politically, China, all kind of closer and closer together. I know they've done a lot of sometimes military exercises together. The various navies have gotten together and do that. How do you see what Putin is gaining on two fronts here as well? Like we looked at the North Korean side, on the diplomatic side, where he's getting more diplomatic pressure or cooperation from these other nations, and then we'll separately look at what he gets physically in terms of ammunition. But let's look at the diplomatic one first. How significant do you think that is to again Western interests?
It's a good question. I don't know how significant it is. I mean, I know there's a conventional analysis out there that essentially is making the Russian-North Korean relationship as some sort of game-changing event in international politics, that this could be a prelude to maybe a military alliance of some sort, whether de facto or de jure. I personally am very skeptical of this relationship kind of escalating to that point. I think in general, this is a very transactional and convenience-laced relationship. Putin needs something from the North. The North needs something from Putin. And right now, the geopolitical circumstances are such that both parties, both sides, find the other to be probably their most convenient partner, and they can get what they need from each other. Diplomatically, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, the Russians and the North Koreans have a long-standing diplomatic relationship and always have been up to the beginning of the Gulf War. But in terms of tangible military equipment, which I guess we'll speak about now,
Yeah.
it's obviously it's a useful relationship with the Russians because they need as much munitions as they can get at a time when their army is pretty much tied down in Ukraine. It continues to be tied down in Ukraine. The North Koreans basically would like Russians to obviously, send military technology of whether it's through whether it's for their ballistic missile capability or the ISR, but they also need basic things like food. The North
Mm.
Koreans have a terrible food situation right now, and their crop outlay has been horrendous over the last 12 months. And the Russians are a big food exporter, so they need basic tangible things like food and even crude oil. And the Russians are happy to provide that in exchange for the munitions they need. So it's a very convenience-laced relationship. And when people say that this is the beginning of something bigger, I just don't buy it. I mean, ultimately we'll see, but
Yeah,
once the war,
I think that's I think there's evidence is supporting that view that it is transactional because I think as long as there's mutual benefit for both sides, I think they're happy to do it. But I mean, North Korea's their whole mentality has always been this juche self-reliance kind of thing, and they even keep a bit of a hand's distance between Beijing, which a lot of people in the West always think is this really tight that Beijing controls Pyongyang. I don't think that. And if China can't control Pyongyang, I can't imagine that Russia's going to from their side here. So I think there's a lot of plausibility what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, the North Koreans don't do alliances, right? I mean, technically they have a treaty alliance with the Chinese, but anybody who thinks China is going to invade or help the North directly in the event of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula is probably needs to take a nap and kind of reassess their thoughts. I think generally the Kim regime knows this. They know the Chinese are supporters economically, but ultimately what the North Koreans want is self-sufficiency in the military sphere. And that's the best way of deterring a hypothetical adversary in the future, whether it's the United States, Japan, or South Korea.
Which gets to your point about the transactional nature and why North Korea is like, if we can use this situation where Russia is in need of what we have, which is the ammunition and Korea, number one, it gets them cash, they get some money for that, but it also gives them the technology so that they can develop their own independent sources so they don't have to rely on anybody. So I think it's just really good. And I think the day that those conditions change, I bet that there'll be some distance put in there. I don't think they'll ever go against each other, but yeah, I tend to agree with you that this is not the beginning of some new NATO type deal or anti-NATO, whatever, against us. It'll change when the conditions change, I think.
Right. And we'll see once the war in Ukraine ends. I would not be surprised whatsoever if the Russians drop the North Koreans like a hot potato.
Right. Right. Because that will work both ways.
The reason why the relationship is in such a warm state right now is because, the war in Ukraine is causing a huge problem for the Russians. And like I said earlier, they need as much military equipment as they can get. And the North Koreans are willing to provide that for a reasonable cost, food, aid, general, oil, energy needs. They're really, really need oil, constant influxes of oil to operate their really shoddy infrastructure in the north. So it's a win-win for both of those sides.
Yeah, and I think this kind of underlying. I've got another clip here to show that what North Korea is getting, I think potentially anyway, from the Russian can have long-term consequences in terms of their advancing their capability. Things are going to last. Watch this.
The Russian president most recently sent a very strong warning to the Western countries that have allowed Ukraine to use long-range weapons against the targets inside Russia, that Russia could actually supply such weapons to the other countries of the world where they will be providing threats to the Western countries. And even though Russia says it knows the sanctions regime against North Korea, certainly there are many concerns that Russia will be working on this track.
See, that's one of the things that some people are suggesting here, and like your opinion on this, is that when Putin a week or so ago made the statements that, well, since the United States and other Western countries are allowing Ukraine to use our weapons, Western weapons, against Russia on their territory, then he may, and he said may, allow other countries to have some of their technology to use against Western assets elsewhere. And the concern is that perhaps Putin could do this visit here could include some of the weapon capabilities that North Korea doesn't even have, aside from just technology. And I wonder if you see any concerns about that.
Well, it's certainly a concern. I would not rule it out, but I would also say that the Russians need to be careful here, because there's another player in this story, and it's China. And China would not appreciate Russia offering the North Koreans the type of military equipment that would contribute to a destabilization on the Korean Peninsula. And the Russians really have it's slim pickings for them at the moment. They're iced out of the West. China is really their bankroller and has been since the war started. And Putin can't really afford to antagonize the Chinese. So I take that point, but I would also add that nothing is set in stone, and there's a lot of gray here. It's not a black and white issue. So
Yeah.
As much as the China and Russia relationship has warmed considerably over the last several years, they do still have tangible differences of policy, and one of that is on the Korean Peninsula. So Putin has to be aware of that.
Yeah, so there are limitations here. John Kirby yesterday was talking about some of his concerns related to what we just got through talking about the growing relationship between Russia and North Korea. Here's how he said it.
Yeah, look, no surprise that he went to North Korea after his so-called election. A real nail-biter that was. He was going to go on a little bit of a charm offensive here, and that's what he appears to be doing. We're not concerned about the trip. What we are concerned about, Trevor, is the deepening relationship between these two countries. Not just because of the impacts it's going to have on the Ukrainian people, because we know North Korean ballistic missiles are still being used to hit Ukrainian targets, but because there could be some reciprocity here that could affect security on the Korean Peninsula. Now, we haven't seen the parameters of all that right now, certainly haven't seen it come to fruition, but we're certainly going to be watching that very, very closely.
So, I mean, that's very similar to what you just said a second ago, but what practically could the United States do? We're watching this and we have some concerns about it, but he didn't say anything about what we're going to do about it. Is there anything the U.S. can do about it?
No, to be completely honest, there is not much we can do. We've had a very stringent economic sanctions regime on the North Koreans since even before they tested their first nuclear device in 2006. And those sanctions have escalated rapidly in the ensuing 17, 18 years since that test. It doesn't seem to be working. And, the North Koreans are masters at sanctions evasion at this point. They have a lot of experience dealing with moving around money that doesn't touch the financial system, the Western financial system. They have a lot of experience in using diplomats overseas to actually, funnel money back to the North Koreans. So they're sort of money making. They're money makers for the regime in addition to being diplomats. And the Russians, of course, are now one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, and the sanctions thus far have not had any change in Putin's calculus.
I wonder if I could
get or any other
talk about that for a second, because I get kind of a sidebar here, but I think it's really important in that how are we seeing the negative outcome and consequences that our sanctions that we have just relied on so much in both North Korea and Russia, that it's actually having negative impact now, or so diminished that it's almost counterproductive and not at all accomplishing policy outcomes for the United States?
Well, it's counterproductive in that, the North Koreans and the Russians are using this as a convenient excuse to kind of justify their weak economies and justify their preconceived notions of U.S. power and U.S. influence and American motives around the world. So in that sense, it is counterproductive. But I would be fine with sanctions personally if it had any demonstrable effect on and actually achieved any policy that we aim to achieve. And I think it's pretty clear. The record is pretty clear at this point with regards to both Russia and North Korea, that sanctions are not doing much of anything to change, the internal decision making calculus of either country. And we have evidence every day of this, and we've had it for years. And I think U.S. officials are in this notion that, well, sanctions is something that we can market to the public as, we're doing something about a problem. We're kind of trying to resolve a problem. In reality, it's not resolving anything, and it's if anything, it's probably complicating the situation over the long term.
And is there anything we can do about this? So what policy changes could the U.S. do to either make sanctions actually effective, or to just try other tools? Because these are clearly not working.
Sanctions, historically speaking, sanctions are the most effective when they're tied to realistic diplomatic, options, realistic diplomatic objectives. So, for instance, the North Korea, and we have this real world experience this with the Iranians when we negotiated a nuclear agreement with Iran in 2015. We used those sanctions and we tied them to very, very realistic policy objectives, which it wasn't get rid of your entire nuclear program. It was essentially let the IAEA in to monitor what you're doing, cap your enrichment levels, cap the number of centrifuges you're operating on a daily basis. And the Iranians felt that was, fair enough. We can get economic sanctions relief in exchange for something that is, bottom line, is not a, it's not a big deal for the Iranians. And quite frankly, we have maximalist objectives with North Korea and Russia. And as long as we have those objectives, sanctions, they're not going to accomplish much of anything. And I think that's the main reason that, the policy objectives are dead on arrival.
Yeah, and that's what I've always thought about the sanctions themselves. They can be a powerful tool if I know that our boss Ed King has often said this. Some of the best uses of sanctions is when they're removed. And so if you can promise that if you'll take this course of action that's beneficial to our side, we'll remove the sanctions and bring relief. But if all we do is put sanctions on, there's no incentive to them to ever do what we want, which is so perverse in how we apply it.
No, and honestly, this is another topic for another day, but a lot of this is political as well, where it's just unpopular in terms of domestic politics to lift sanctions on anybody, even if it's justified. So, when you see sanctions lists year by year, you see a bunch of designations, and maybe the removals are 1/10 of what the designations are. So just politically speaking, it's very unpopular for a policymaker to remove economic restrictions from the quote unquote bad guys, even if that's what it takes to actually, sign an agreement of some sort.
Yeah. Well, you're right. We'll have to leave that one for another day because that's another seeming intractable issue here. I want to run back to some of the other things that you put in that article. I think they're really important to talk. Gary, if you can bring up, I think it's number 2 on the list that I sent you. You wrote in here that it would be unwise for U.S. policymakers to brush the current tensions between North and South Korea under the rug or assume the latest tit for tat between the two Koreas will burn itself out. Instead, the longer it continues, the more difficult it will be for both Pyongyang and Seoul to reverse themselves by instituting de-escalatory measures or exploring whether even informal accommodations are possible. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you mean by that and what should happen.
Right. So I don't believe there's going to be a war on the Korean Peninsula in the short or even medium term. That's not my argument. My argument is that conflict could arise even with miscalculation, misinterpretation of each other's motives or actions, and just outright confusion between between the two sides. And on the Korean Peninsula, I think that's very, very evident and dangerous because it's literally the most armed region of the world. The DMZ is mined. It's got tank traps. It's got an extreme amount of ordnance. You have soldiers on both sides who have actually been killed during peacetime in the DMZ as well. So this is a problem that requires far more pragmatism than we've been willing to kind of consider. preemptive war between North and South? No, I don't think that's going to occur because the costs are too high for either
Yeah,
side, right?
for either side.
The problem is, if you're not speaking to one another, if you have wrong interpretations, if you have a military exercise close to the DMZ that the other side views as provocative or a bellicose first stage of an invasion, that's when things could get hairy very quickly. So I was trying to basically in that article remind people how important it is, even during peacetime, how important it is to actually communicate with each other, even if we don't want to. In the best case scenario, we need to
Yeah.
talk. If we don't, trouble could be around the corner, even if we do everything we can to
And
avoid it.
and don't even intend it. Yeah, I couldn't more strongly agree with you. Gary, now bring up I believe it's number 5. That's the conclusion in there. One of I thought this was really important too, and I wanted to get some your commentary on it. You say that deterring an adversary from attacking is only half the battle. The other is inherently connected to deterrence, is kind of what you've been saying, is communicating red lines to your adversaries, ensuring no wires are crossed, managing expectations, and if possible, exploring mutual steps to diffuse confusion and conflict. This is sorely lacking on the Korean Peninsula today and is an extremely dicey status quo to carry into the future. Ultimately, every actor with a stake in the region's stability has a responsibility to mitigate it. How can they mitigate it? Let's look first with the United States. How can the United States mitigate that issue?
Well, unfortunately, the United States, they do have high stake on the Korean Peninsula because we have close to 29,000 troops stationed in South Korea. But I think the real players here are the two Koreas. Those are the players that need to get together in the same room and start talking to each other again. That's a very low ask, by the way. We're not saying that they have to resolve their political differences because they're not going to resolve them. All we're saying is, start talking to each other and communicate what you're planning to do, what your military exercises are designed to do. And again, I mentioned this in the beginning. The best way to do this is for both sides, both Koreas, to get back into the de-escalation accord that they withdrew from. That was a very effective piece of paper. That was a very effective agreement. The North Koreans ditched it last year because they got tired of what they viewed as South Korea's antics. And the South Koreans last month, or may have even been this month, they decided to suspend their participation in the accord as well. That may not sound like that may not sound like a big deal, but it is, because if you suspend the accord, you're suspending all of the links that were previously available to discuss whatever you want to discuss. That's the best way to kind of lower the tension. It's not to negotiate a new agreement. It's to use the agreement that was already negotiated and get back into it in a mutually acceptable way.
And do you see any possibility at all in the even medium future that they can get back there? Is there any way to start moving in that direction? Because it seems to me the sides are still doing this.
Yeah, they are, and it's short term. No, I don't see it, because the North Koreans and the South Koreans are basically in the stage where they're kind of testing each other and irritating each other in a way that's kind of juvenile, quite frankly. With the North Koreans sending balloons into the South, and then the South Koreans sending K-pop music across the border into the North. These don't serve any purpose whatsoever. It's one-upsmanship.
Antagonism, right? The other side, yeah.
It's antagonism for no purpose.
So I don't, now correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I am, I don't see any evidence that the Biden administration has any interest in providing some aggressive leadership to try and corral the two sides back together. But do you, at least from what you know, do you see any possibility that if Trump should win the next election, that he might be willing to do that, to try kind of recapture some of the magic from 2018, I think?
I would not be surprised whatsoever if Trump tried to reinstate, a diplomatic process with Kim Jong-un. The question, I think, is whether Kim would be willing to do a second bite of the apple, because, like I said earlier, he was really humiliated in Hanoi. This was a personal diplomatic initiative on his part, and he came away with absolutely nothing. So, is Kim willing to kind of sacrifice more political capital and hurt his image internationally a second time around with the same guy who walked away from the table? I don't know the answer to that. We're going to have to see. But in terms of Trump, I would not be surprised in the slightest if he tried to initiate something. And
Yeah,
quite frankly, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I kind of agree with that. Now, I've talked to some folks that are working on the Trump campaign. They seem to be a lot more interested in it than the current administration is. But my sense is exactly to the point you just made about the other side of the equation with the Kim Jong-un, that if there was some reach out, I suspect that Kim would be willing to entertain it, but he would probably have a pretty big ask up front.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and also, North Korea's would be far less likely to even entertain a major diminution of its nuclear weapons power, let alone denuclearization. Like I said, that's not going to happen. So if Trump, hypothetically, initiates a diplomatic process and he's obsessed with denuclearization as previous presidents were, he might as well just go home and not waste the taxpayer dollars on a flight to North Korea.
Right. I think you're right on that. Well, listen, Dan, thank you so much for coming on today and providing this illuminating conversation on the North and South Korea issue, which is kind of fallen off the tables of most of the people in the West. But it's like you said, we have 29,000 troops on there, so it's a big issue for the United States to pay attention to. And I'm grateful for you coming on and providing so much clarity on this, especially today. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
And we thank you for joining us today as well. We appreciate you signing up today. And listen, we got Larry Johnson coming on this afternoon. He's going to be talking about some of the claims that the U.S. Is making on that our weapons are making a difference on the battlefield. Is it really? And if it's not, what do we need to do that's any different? We're also going to talk about some of the updated situations with these peace processes that we're going on both in Switzerland and that Putin's on, and how all this is working together. You're not going to want to miss that. Folks, listen, we want you to sign up, and we have a new membership program that has some definite perks. Those are starting to show up on our channel now. We've got another one coming up on Friday, where we're going to directly engage with you guys who are members. And we had such a good time on our first one that we had a week or so ago. Looking forward to this one here. Also, we need you to to become not just members, but to subscribe and to join up also, because that really helps us expand the message here. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth, hardcore truth like this that a lot of the major media is not covering. And we really need your help to help us amplify that to other people. And joining is one of the best ways, and subscribing and sharing is another big one. Pretty low cost, but it really helps us all out. So thanks, and we'll see you this afternoon at 3 o'clock on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.